Servant, put on my royal robes.
Put on yourself.
This appears to be a crisis in leadership. Let's talk about that.
How about now?
Hey guys, this is Andrew with another Sabbath School short, and this week we're on lesson number 2, looking in the book of Isaiah, and the title for this week is called Crisis of Leadership. And the memory text for this week is found in Isaiah chapter 6 verse 1, and it says this: In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. And so we're going to be looking at the reason why God sent Isaiah, the need that was present during the time of the nation, and why Isaiah was sent to do his prophetic ministry during this time. And the quote there in Sabbath afternoon's lesson that I really like, it says, "People do indeed want strong, trustworthy leadership. When a soldier was signing up for a second term of duty, the army recruiter asked why he wanted to re-enlist. I tried civilian life, he said, but nobody is in charge out there." This week, we will look at Judah's crisis of leadership and the sad results that followed. And so we'll be discussing the need, like I said, the need of good leadership and why God sent Isaiah to Judah during this time of this crisis of leadership that they had. So looking over at Sunday's lesson, which is titled "The King is Dead, Long Live the King." And the lesson kind of brings out 4 distinct things. I couldn't really pick out a single quote that we normally do for each lesson because it kind of talks about 4 distinct different things about King Uzziah and how King Uzziah's reign, it was long and prosperous, but he eventually grew proud, which led to his downfall, and kind of the contrast between Uzziah and Isaiah, very similar names, Uzziah and Isaiah, and how Uzziah was reaching for holiness, but he was reaching for it for the wrong reasons because of his pride, and how Isaiah was seeking the Lord not because of that, for the right reasons, and talking about, too, the striking similarity between Uzziah's leprosy body and how that was kind of a symbol of the state of the people of Judah at that time, and then how the death of Uzziah really marked this major crisis in leadership for God's people, and he died around 740 BC, the lesson brings out. And this is a really a terrible time, because it's always bad when a king of a big nation dies. It leaves them vulnerable, but this is even worse because Tiglath-Pileser III, who had ascended to the throne of Assyria, basically had launched this huge campaign to make Assyria the world power, and all these independent nations, it really threatened their existence in the Near East. And so in this time of crisis, we see a big need, and this is where God sends Isaiah, where he commissions Isaiah to go out and to proclaim the message that he wants him to proclaim. But he gives him encouragement, and he gives him the encouragement that God is still in control, even though it doesn't necessarily look like it. And so looking over at Monday's lesson, which is titled "Holy, Holy, Holy," and the quote that I like there, it says, "While taken in vision, Isaiah gazed upon the blazing glory of God upon his throne, heard the antiphony of shining seraphim calling out the words, 'Holy, holy, holy,' felt the resultant seismic shaking of the floor beneath him, and peered through swirling smoke as if it filled the temple. It must have been a stunning experience for the prophet. For sure, Isaiah now knew who was in control, despite outward events." And I really like the question actually that the lesson asks. This is, where is the Lord in this vision? He's sitting on the throne. And this is a really important picture that God is showing to Isaiah in prophecy, or in vision, of this idea that God is still on the throne, that God's still in control. And what a relevant message for us today, because when we look around with the pandemic and everything that's happening in this world, it can really, really be easy to lose sight of the fact that God's still in control. But guys, God is still on the throne. He's still on the throne over the world, over my life, over your life. He's still on the throne. And it's really important to remember that. And that's kind of what this Monday's lesson tries to bring about and tell us. Is like, hey, it was crazy back then, it's crazy now, but God's still on the throne. Don't forget that. God is still on the throne. And looking over at Tuesday's lesson, which is titled "New Personality," the quote that I like there, it says, "The seraph explained that through touching the prophet's lips, his guilt and sin were removed. The sin is not specified, but need not be limited to wrong speech, because lips signify not only speech, but also the entire person who utters it. Having received moral purification, Isaiah was now able to offer pure praise to God. And this kind of continuing this vision where Isaiah is literally in the presence of God, and he says, I can't be here, I'm unclean. You are perfect, God. I can't be here, I'm unclean. I'm a man of unclean lips. And then this seraphim grabs a living coal and touches his lips and basically declares him to be clean. And this is kind of the idea that God is giving him a new personality, like the lesson said, a purification to be able to go out and proclaim this message that God has for him, preparing Isaiah for the prophetic ministry that God has in store for him. And, God does the same thing for us today. Not that we're all called to be prophets, but the fact that God gives us a new life so that we may then go out and share his message. We can't give until we have received, right? And it's this kind of this idea that God's working with Isaiah, is the fact that I will cleanse you so you can go out and do this thing that I'm calling you to do, to be the prophet that I need you to be. And then looking over at Wednesday's lesson kind of continues this idea entitled Royal Commission. And the quote that I like there, it says, it appears that chapters 1 through 5 of Isaiah represent conditions at the time when Isaiah was first called, after which God jump-started his ministry by encouraging him at the temple and reconfirming his commission as God's prophetic spokesman. And the lesson brings out Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8 there at the top. It says, also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send and who will go for us? Then said I, here am I, send me. And it talks about how it's interesting how the book of Isaiah doesn't actually start with Isaiah's prophetic call, as most prophetic books do. They start with the call of the prophet. But this comes later, and as it said, the chapters 1 through 5 kind of describe the state of God's people, of Judah at the time, and the need, once again, for God to send Isaiah. And then this whole call that God has on Isaiah is to encourage him, to give him that new life, as it talked about in the previous lesson, and reconfirming his commission as God's prophetic spokesman. Basically, God's saying, this is going to be difficult. This is going to be really hard, but don't forget that you were called by me. Don't forget that I am with you in this, and I'm empowering you. I am encouraging you to do this thing. And I know many times God calls us to do very difficult things. I don't know what God's calling you to do in your life. I know God's called me to do some very difficult things in my life. But remembering that God has called us means that he will equip us and he will keep us moving forward in the calling that he's given to us, just as he did for Isaiah way back when. So looking over at Thursday's lesson, which is titled Appalling Appeal, and the quote that I like there, it says, God's role and that of his servants is to give people a fair choice so that they will have adequate warning, even if they end up choosing destruction and exile. And this idea that God appeals to our hearts so that we can respond by saying yes to him. And it talks about, too, this idea of God hardening people's heart. It talks about Pharaoh, too, and how God is constantly trying to call out to us. But if we constantly choose to reject him and to reject him and reject him, there's nothing more that God can do. And in that sense, God is hardening our hearts. That's what it talks about with Pharaoh, too, in that sense that God is trying to call out to us, but yet we keep rejecting him. That freedom of choice is still there, but God is constantly appealing to us to come to him. And that's what God is trying to do through Isaiah, is use him as an instrument of this appeal to the people of Judah to say, hey, I'm still here. You guys have been turning your back on me. Do you not see the situation that you're in? But I'm still here. I'm using Isaiah to show you that I'm still trying to call you to come back to me, to reason with me, so that we can work this thing out so you can come back to myself. And I know that for you, for you watching, and for me myself too, when I think about my life and how God calls me every single day back to himself. God calls you every single day back to himself. He yearns for you. He appeals to you to come back to him. What better day to start now to say yes to that and to come back to God, just like he was trying to do with the nation so long ago. And then kind of closing up in Friday in the further thought section, there's another really long quote by Ellen White there from Prophets and Kings, that I thought was really, really powerful. But I encourage you once again, just kind of go read that for yourself. After all, this whole series is pointing you back to the Sabbath School lesson, to go study it for yourself. So I encourage you to go look at that quote, because it's really powerful and it's really good. And it really touched me in a way that showed how God was using Isaiah during this time. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this week's Sabbath School Short, as we talked about this crisis of leadership and how God used Isaiah to bring an appeal back to Judah, to say, come back to myself. Please give a thumbs up for this video and subscribe to Advent Blueprint for future content that we are going to be releasing. And comment down below, how have you responded to God's appeal recently, in the past, maybe sometimes looking back on your life saying, man, I really wish I had responded in a different way back then. What has your experience been like with listening to the appeal of God and responding to that appeal? We'd love to have a conversation with you down in the comments below. We hope to see you on next week's Sabbath School Short, and we'll see you then.